Welcome everybody to the latest episode in my relatively new Conversations with Otto series. It's the third episode, and I'm really delighted to have another one of my talented, diverse, and highly productive co-authors, Mikayla Novak. Mikayla, it's such a great pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much, Otto. It's a great honour to be on your podcast, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. Now, so first to give you a bit of a sense of who I am, and then I'll introduce the quest. So I'm a postdoc at New York University's Classical Liberal Institute at the School of Law, and also at the Center for Bioethics. And I've started this program to interview people I know, people I work with, partly to just to talk about the process of working together, and also the products that come out of it, and also the people behind the dry academic veneer, right? and so today's guest is a very special guest of mine, and she, like many of the best people, is working across multiple disciplines and across disciplines, which I think is very important. So Dr. Mikayla Novak is Senior Fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And she holds not one, but two PhDs, one in Sociology from the Australian National University, and one in Economics from RMIT University in Melbourne. I actually don't know what RMIT stands for. I'll have to ask you about that. She has joined Mercatus, and Mercatus is one of the leading platforms for really cutting-edge PPE work, cutting-edge work in political economy. And the previous guest I had, well, actually 2 episodes ago, Nathan Goodman, is a colleague and fellow of Mikayla's, and also our joint co-author on one paper that we'll be discussing today as well. But Mikayla has, contributed a lot, worked not only in academic world, but also given opinion pieces, editorials, public policy type analysis in a lot of areas, and also authored at least, how many books is it now? At least 2 or 3?
Yeah, it's 3 and more coming.
That's right. So she's the author of Inequality, an Entangled Political Economy Perspective, and also Freedom in Contention, Social Movements and Liberal Political Economy. And she's the editor of a volume that came out last year, in which she also has contributions, and in which I also have a contribution, and which is a really, I think, wonderful book that we'll be discussing a lot today, which is Liberal Emancipation. The book is called Liberal Emancipation, Explorations in Political and Social Economy. And I love everything about this book, including the cover and the color coding. It's fabulous. So, okay, let's actually start from how does it feel to you when you hold one of your books in your hands when it finally comes out?
Well, that's a really great question, Otto, because I'll take a sort of step back to sort of just give an insight as to how I feel about these things, to say that, I've had a sort of fairly long career, and also a sort of career where I've sort of traversed along very different pathways. So after I did my sort of undergraduate and honours year in economics in Australia, I spent 10 years working in the Australian civil service, basically in government, both at sort of the state and the sort of the federal level. So I sort of spent 10 years there. And then after that, I basically spent a couple of years shy of 10 years in a free market think tank in Australia called the Institute of Public Affairs. And during that time, I actually did my economics PhD at RMIT University, which stands for Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology University. So it's very much an applied research university. And I did that in that PhD, finished that in 2013. So having done all of that, and certainly throughout all of that time, I'll freely admit, aspiring to want to enjoy an academic career at some point, being able to sort of hold one of my own books, is a real sort of humbling and delightful experience. But I will say, without sort of embarrassing you or anyone who sort of contributes to, for example, co-edited endeavors, it's just such a thrill and honor to be able to showcase the sort of the leading edge scholarly work produced by yourself, and many others as well. For example, in that Liberal Emancipation book, and indeed, I will say that I reread your chapter just for my sort of leisure and enlightenment just the other day, Otto, and it's just a wonderful piece that I can just recommend to everyone. It's called Power to the Powerless, Evolutionary Freedom as Emancipation. It's such a sort of careful meditation with respect to the effects of the intersections between evolution and normatively emancipatory outcomes. So to put it all in short, I really sort of feel a sense of humility and delight, which I'm hoping is the right way to actually feel about one's own work.
Well, I'm very delighted and very grateful for your words, and the check is in the mail. So
yeah, absolutely. I'll be waiting.
But I guess you'll be taking that in crypto, right? So I have to send it to your crypto wallet. As you also worked on issues of crypto, which I'll hopefully also have a chance to ask about. But I do have also a question about how your experience coming from Australia to the US has been. I mean, what are the biggest culture shocks, or do you feel a natural continuity within the sort of broader sort of Commonwealth and English-speaking world context?
Look, that's an excellent question. So I came to the US, and I've now been here in the US close to 4 years now, and enjoying every moment of it. To be honest with you, I did expect to be a lot of cultural congruity between Australia and the US, because there's a sort of a general understanding that perhaps the country that is probably arguably most emulative of US cultural norms is actually Australia, right? So in terms of sort of just this sort of cultural imitation of everything US, sort of Australia is pretty much sort of one step behind, but it is always interesting. So we have this sort of set of ideas, all these insights as part of what we call mainline political economy here at GMU, which also relate to economic sociology, that give very great emphasis to the importance of context, cultural context, social context, the sort of the differentiability of those contexts, the variability. So what I'm really saying here is that ultimately what was actually sort of different, or maybe not so shocking, but required some sort of process of adjustment, were all the small things. So there's sort of many small things, just basic mundane activities like crossing the road, or for example, do taxes get embedded in prices or not, or what on earth is tipping? I'm still trying to work that out after 4 years. So there are all these little things that are actually incredibly important, that probably tend to get overlooked by sort of social scientists, sort of I guess sort of living and thinking on high, so to speak. But all of which cumulatively really sort of add or constrain, enable, limit human experience in many profound ways. In a lot of ways too, if I may sort of say so in a Hayekian vein, a lot of these things are inarticulable. You've got to actually be in the moment, in the environment you actually experience all of these sort of little quirks that I just wouldn't have known before sort of being a sort of permanent resident here.
Did you find the academic environment kind of the same everywhere, or are there issues around how people work or how people approach the academic life that are different?
So I'll say a couple of things. So I've noted that in the US, and this is actually what I love about the US, there really is truly an emphasis upon productivity, and the sort of the self-responsibility to be a productive scholar, a productive worker, to be a sort of productive collegial colleague, to others. I mean, there's really sort of a sharp sort of emphasis on that that may not be sort of so evident in other places around the world. The other thing I guess I have only sort of partial experiences of academic life in Australia, but it seems to me that, and I'm supposing that similar trends are apparent in the US, but I certainly felt that in the former case in Australia, a lot of these sort of forces were becoming more apparent. There was sort of a greater emphasis in Australia, I thought, in terms of higher education and its operational environment upon grant seeking, upon sort of making interlinkages with public policy influencers and deciders and so on. And I think part of that is the reason for that is that Australia has a very centralized, if not sort of, one may dare say, a Soviet-style model of sort of grants determination. There's a sort of a big government sort of funded body, almost monolithic in Australia, called the Australian Research Council, and through which a lot of attention goes through, and through which I also think public policy influence sort of seeps in to academic life in Australia. So, for example, where unconditional funds gradually become conditional, one example of that may be, well, over the last 5-10 years in Australia, Australian governments have increasingly insisted upon academics receiving grants from the ARC to be able to do things like show impact, to be able to absolve, sort of academic activities from undue foreign interference, and all sort of show, social, economic, triple bottom line sort of impacts and so on and so forth. So there's sort of lost, what I'm saying in the end is that there tended to be sort of a lot of prescriptiveness that tended to be sort of bound in that. I'm certain that academics in the US would attest to similar forces at work, but that was something very conspicuous, at least in my own partial experience back in Australia.
And now you've been at GMU, which is kind of known for its first of all, its combination of different strands of thinking, right? So it's very much heterodox in the way that it builds up this. Some people say that the mainline political economy really is kind of one of the main lines of historical political economy, but nonetheless, it's perceived as being heterodox. But it is mostly about putting together different things into a kind of a really productive sort of ecosystem of scholarship. And I think some of the most exciting scholarship today is coming out of that work, and I think it's still underappreciated. There's so much good work coming out of there, how would you view that what is the intellectual climate like at GMU, and what is the contribution that it makes to the current sort of scholarship world?
So I'll sort of say it this way, and I'll try to sort of remove as much bias as possible, because I have a lot of affection for sort of GMU and the uniqueness that it provides in the world, as well as the Mercatus Centre. So I actually think that so what we have provide here is sort of indispensable academic sort of scholarship for humankind. So as you've indicated, we tend to sort of promulgate a strand of thinking that we call mainline political economy, which is descended effectively from Adam Smith and Karl Menger, right? So sort of two key European thinkers, and from there sort of spin out, many very notable figures such as Mises and Hayek and sort of James Buchanan and Tulloch and the sort of Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom. And so all of these sort of ideas sort of share a few core commitments, right? So an understanding or appreciation of spontaneous or emergent order, which was a central theme, incidentally discussed again in your book chapter for the Liberal Emancipation book. So appreciation for emergent order, an appreciation for the constructive, and a constructive role of markets, not only in undergirding material prosperity, but in facilitating human flourishing across sort of multiple dimensions. And then sort of finally a commitment for government, but government that is limited and constitutionally constrained to prevent the arbitrariness and the dominance that might otherwise be exuded by predation. So you got this sort of this core of a program here that is unique, that emphasizes, for example, process, right, in the economy, in society, in polity, that you don't necessarily get elsewhere, which I think is incredibly important, and certainly, you know, as scholars and staffers, both at GMU and Mercatus, we have a very much an everyday and ever-present stake in upholding this sort of the flame of that mainline tradition, you know, for the benefit, including emancipatory benefit of humankind.
Yes, this idea of emancipation, which you know, is in the title of the book that I have held up here, and that we talked about and will talk about. Emancipation is, I think, one of these issues that shows that, you know, some people worry, some people claim that, you know, really what is going on in places like GMU is, so it's just you know, it's just another place for groupthink, you know, people who like free markets just come together but it's really I think a really productive and really, you know, serious and constantly evolving research program, right? And it's really tackling with issues that are at the intersection of the economy, of culture, of civil society and institutions, and moral values, right? And it's trying to build this vision that unites your own background in sociology, right, with economics, and also my background in moral philosophy, and all of these issues coming together, right? And I think that's what's been missing. So, you know, regardless of what people's particular, you know, economic views happen to be, I think it's absolutely extremely valuable to get out of the chains and the shackles put on research by the, you know, seemingly sort of reasonable expansion of the sort of scientific mentality, which focuses on setting very sort of simple, clear, formal models on the one hand, and on the other hand doing a kind of like very empirically driven work. But I think what's often missing from the neoclassical perspective or mainstream political science or economics is this broader, you know, sort of holistic view of the interlink between different aspects of society and how they generate these processes of development, of learning, and of coordination, right?
Yeah, so that's all beautifully said, Otto, and thank you very much for saying that. So, and I thoroughly agree with you. And so, what I'll say about in response to your statement is this. So the Mikayla Center in GMU actually issue groupthink, and we issue groupthink because of the sheer interdisciplinarity of our academic interests. And so I'll give a really sort of good example and perhaps some encouragement, especially for sort of young scholars who may wish to engage in, for example, with GMU and the Mercatus Center with respect to our sort of fellowship programs. And in fact, we actually have fellowship programs with applications for the next academic year actually open right now. People can just Google the Mercatus Center and find information about all of these. But we actually actively strive to invite young scholars, graduate scholars, undergraduates, even sort of high school students to engage with us from a variety of variety of disciplinary perspectives, even worldviews, ideologies, perspectives, because I think that the really a touchstone for a healthy evolutionary process, epistemic process, even a social and democratic process, is for people to sort of come together and basically thrash out ideas. And I'm certain that if people apply, for example, for for our Mercatus fellowships, they'll be pleasantly surprised to actually find that indeed there's no groupthink. We're actually very interested in a wide array of topics from a variety of perspectives, and that's really I think that's really what interdisciplinarity that you've beautifully alluded to, that's what it requires.
Exactly. And now one of the aspects that this is shown is that is in the fact that, for example, in the chapter that you have in the book, you discuss together with your co-authors. It's with Emily Chamley Wright, right?
That's correct.
This chapter, yep. And you write about this idea of the four corners of liberalism. And first, I guess we should say, like, how does liberalism fit into all of this? What is liberalism to you, and why is that an important part of your research program?
Great. I mean, so liberalism is a cluster of interrelating yet somewhat divergent, even somewhat contestable set of ideas that have been effectively arbitrated and negotiated intellectually and practically over time, that in the end are motivated by those core commitments that I referred to earlier. So an emphasis on spontaneous or emergent order as an explanation of human and social phenomena, then an emphasis on market process, then constitutionally constrained government. So even though there's going to be varieties within liberalism that actually stretch from, let's say, anarcho-capitalism that may be synonymous with the likes of Murray Rothbard or David Friedman or someone like that, through to, let's say, an emphasis on the welfare state. And, people continue to debate to what extent, for example, John Maynard Keynes, is regarded as a liberal. He certainly regarded himself as a liberal, but a certain kind of welfarist liberal who accepted the need for a welfare state. So even there, you can actually imagine a cut and thrust within intellectual liberalism that is actually quite vibrant, and which will actually have very interesting combinatorial potentials in an ideational sense. So in this book chapter that you referred to by Emily Chamley Wright, who's the president for the Institute for Humane Studies, and myself. So we actually think about the interconnectedness between four branches of liberalism. So we have cultural liberalism, an epistemic or intellectual liberalism. We have an economic liberalism. We have a political liberalism. And so this actually brings to life, I think, a very unique societal process in which entrepreneurial individuals in an ideational, even in a practical sense, can be able to creatively refer to different aspects of liberalism in order to make context-specific arguments for social change of an emancipatory nature. Right. So, for example, the civil rights movement can, in the United States, and they did refer to, obviously, the political liberal commitment to democratic equality among natural equals, right, as a way to dispel racial inequality. And they coupled that with a very interesting set of intellectual tools, even theological tools, right, to be able to give reference to the reformist nature of racial equality back to a long tradition, right, of thinking about the equality of humankind and the need for emancipation there. And there are many other examples like that in which we can think about these four corners or these four aspects of liberalism. Now, I think in the chapter itself, Emily and I, refer to a metaphor of drawbridges, between these four corners, right? So there are going to be tensions, right, between these things, but within the tensions spring out the dynamism, which we sort of hope, hopefully as guided by appropriate quality institutions that actually valorize some of these underlying liberal commitments that we speak about, can actually help bring forth constructive change for the betterment of ever more people. That can be on the basis of race, as we discussed, or gender, or sexuality, or ability or disability, or whatever other sort of category may be sort of open for discovery, discourse, and action.
That's right. And the way you think about these things is that there's ways of conceiving the interactions in a way that is fully aware of the tensions that exist, but nonetheless strives to achieve a kind of a unified understanding of the ways in which kind of the same principles can be seen as underlying the motivations and the aspirations of all of them, and that there is something between them, something like, you know, unified vision of liberalism that can combine kind of the vision of how these things interlink, right?
Yeah, and if I may, you're absolutely correct about what you've just sort of said there in terms of your description, and this actually sort of follows very neatly into your own chapter in the book, where you sort of refer to emancipation as a cultural, sociological, and political sort of species of innovation. More broadly, now, sort of the sort of actions that are necessary to induce or generate innovation within sort of social and cultural and political systems, sometimes they may lead to sort of dead ends, where they, for example, they may not sort of lead to sort of widespread public acceptability among sort of compatriots whom we are trying to sort of persuade. But given the sort of the right circumstances in an evolutionary sense, the program of emancipation qua innovation can really tangibly lead to much better outcomes, including for the poor and downtrodden. And you know, as your listeners may well be aware of your own scholarship, you refer, for example, to, let's say, universal basic income technologies, financing and provisioning technologies as a potential way to emancipate materially and also non-materially those who are sort of poor and downtrodden. Its own process, therefore, of emancipation.
Yeah, indeed, I've written about that. But I think the wonderful thing about a book like this, which, you know, oftentimes when you have a collection of many authors, you know, you sort of struggle to find the golden thread. But I think reading through this book, and you find that there's so much here that's putting, even though there's sociologists, economists, philosophers. There's great papers on, for example, there's a chapter on James Buchanan's theory of emancipation through the concept of the artifactual man by Alan Marciano and John Meadowcroft. There's a chapter by Bobby Herzberg on Ostromian self-governance. It's a very great collection, but I think what really comes out of it is that these are the aspects of when people, I think, associate sometimes the term classical liberal or libertarian, they may think of association with fusionism and with certain aspects of kind of small government conservatism, right? But I mean, what is really, I think, coming out of this is that there is this broader, deeper tradition that is more wonderful, in my view, that is more powerful in its implications and in its potential to liberate people. That the idea of freedom is really tied to the idea of not just leave me alone, but let us build a society where that freedom can flourish and that freedom can produce marvelous results by the interaction of free and equal people in a society of equals.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And in some cases, perhaps of the sort of perception surrounding classical liberalism or libertarianism is sometimes even worse. For example, in the popular imagination, this sort of ruse, this sort of, I think actually, to be frank about it, untruth to the effect that classical liberalism or libertarianism is basically sort of code or a project for exclusion, right? Radical exclusion of people when I clearly see in this book and others too, and I'll mention here Pete Becky's book, The Struggle for a Better World, which was a very strong motivator for me to want to put this sort of volume together, sort of talking about a more sort of uplifting vision, right, for freedom and liberty in the world. And I mean, to be honest with you, Otto, I really think that people are actually thirsty for a more uplifting sort of vision of how we can live better together in the world in a way that not only allows for sort of collective action, but allows for individual agency and empowerment, the inclusion of different perspectives, basically sort of wrestling with the tensions, but also grasping the opportunities that can be had, not through this sort of radical autonomous exclusion, living on your own island in a sort of metaphorical sort of manner of speech, but freedom as a notion of doing things together. And it seems to me, I mean, and we talked about in your introduction, for example, one of our sort of shared papers with Nathan Goodman with respect to combinatorial innovation. And that seems to me like a really excellent economic example, at least, of the instantiation of freedom as a voluntaristic yet collaborative and cooperative project. This was really the aim of the book. And I really hope because of that, because of the fact that I think humankind does desperately need a good sort of dose of uplifting, that the book itself, hopefully, will stand the test of time.
Excellent. And the term emancipation is really fascinating to me because, literally it means letting out of someone's hands. That's the etymological meaning of the term, and it's associated with the emancipation of the serfs and the slaves. And it's the literal freeing of someone who's in bondage, and that is the kind of the strongest associated with the term. But then it has been taken up by various types of socialist and radical egalitarian thinkers as a term of a critique of various types of power structures, and a lot of those, of course, are associated with a radical critique of capitalism, what they perceive of capitalism as a system of domination. And we can get into to what extent there's overlap between the sort of emancipatory liberal critique of power structures and something like the harmful aspects of what we might call aspects of market society or aspects of capitalism. But certainly there's a shared interest in thinking about how the harmful power structures can be resisted, how sites of liberation can be built up, and under what conditions we can live together in ways that are not exclusionary, that do not depend on the marking out of the internal enemy, that do not depend on the exclusion into some kind of a second-class citizen status of some members of society, that does not depend on leaving behind, the sick and the poor to die on the streets, right? Would this be a fair statement of kind of the shared interest and shared project, and why the emancipation is for you also valuable?
Yes, look, I do think that there's an opportunity presented in this book to reach across philosophical and ideological aisles. And I hope that it might prove to be an opportunity as well to have a sort of constructive dialogue with non-liberals, even to the extent that they may sort of disagree, for example, with regard to the non-dominating and empowering sort of aspects of markets. Now, it's very interesting always sort of thinking about sort of socialism and its properties, what sort of gives it a sort of sense of esteem among the population, but also its limitations as well. I mean, there have been many classical liberals, including Hayek in his 1949 piece, The Intellectuals and Socialism, who at least gave socialism credit for the creative, linguistic, and discursive ability to be able to sort of persuade a sort of public with sort of soaring rhetoric. and to be able to identify sources of potential marginalization and oppression that people feel. But of course, Hayek and many other sort of mainline economists have identified that, of course, there are very many practical flaws associated with sort of trying to instantiate socialism in the world. And one of those sort of the more powerful critiques, I think, is actually presented by Don Lavoie in his book National Economic Planning: What is Left, and that's the subtitle of his book, where he basically illuminates what you've described in your own research, what I have, and what others have described as the power problem. Now, it may well be the case that sort of socialism on paper may wish to sort of lead a certain charge for human emancipation, but the issue is that to the extent that socialism sees the implementation of such emancipation to be solely operationalized through the coercive state, you've got an obvious problem, because the paradox of power. So the power of government to emancipate people with its might, its legal might, its fiscal might, its regulatory might, can also paradoxically be used to actually abuse individuals and groups as well, including groups based on whichever sort of cleavages that you can imagine. And so we sort of have this sort of socialistic tragedy in practice, of course, where this is exemplified by the Soviet Union, the sort of Eastern Bloc countries, and even sort of North Korea and mainland China today, where effectively, in the name of emancipation through a socialistic project, you're going to have very extreme subjugation and domination for a whole variety of grounds. So there are margins for discussion, but there are equally, I think, as well, sort of margins for critique. And to be certain, socialists are very forward in their critiques of liberalism, right? And so this is all sort of part of this sort of process. So I think I'll just sort of follow from that in saying that what is always really interesting to me is the sort of following question. To what extent can a liberal society, an open society that you discussed in a very perceptive paper jointly written with Kaveh Porvand in Constellations, with respect to this sort of the open society, to what extent can liberalism tolerate socialism? But then you can ask the flip side question: to what extent can socialism tolerate liberalism? Well, it seems to me that in terms of practical experience, socialism doesn't really seem, at least in its statist sense, to be able to tolerate liberalism at all. I mean, you have many sort of dissidents who sort of end up in a status of being a political prisoner just by virtue of expressing liberal belief. Whereas it's interesting to sort of think about liberal societies in which that have been able to accommodate socialistic expression, sort of production through the market, quite interestingly and perhaps ironically, of literature through the market. There's a rich market in socialistic literature, as you know. And finally, as a sort of another thought about that with respect to small-scale intentional communities of communes within liberal societies throughout sort of the history, at least in sort of Western countries, that have tried small-scale socialistic experiments. They've almost uniformly failed, but nonetheless, the genius of a liberal society is that in the quest for emancipation, you ultimately allow, normatively and practically, the right to try.
The right to try, the right to the right to innovate is also, like you mentioned, innovation being one of the sort of neglected aspects. I think overall the neglected aspect of a lot of this is dynamism. How much dynamism are we willing to accept? How much dynamism are we willing to not just tolerate, but also to leverage, to harness, to guide in the directions of mutually beneficial directions. Of course, one could say, well, it's possible to have a very dynamic and miserable world. That would be a world where you have just competition without rules, right? You have basically just like anything goes, and people are just kind of constantly trying to get on each other's throats through violence or deception, and that's kind of the Hobbesian struggle of all against all in a way. But what the socialists are saying, that the relations of private property and market relations are kind of too much in that domain of cutthroat competition, and to be able to really produce good outcomes for a vast majority of people. And I think what the liberal alternative is to engage seriously with the objections to the liberal project in its various forms, but also to keep the liberal project alive and to keep it as an active research program and an active thought collective, to use another term that's sometimes thrown about. That is, emancipation is not something that necessarily comes with a ready-made blueprint. It's something that we kind of all discover. Discovery, another Hayekian term, another Don Lavoie term, is very much at the heart of even realizing what does liberalism require for us today.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, you've made some sort of quite perceptive comments there. Sort of Hayek is especially notable, for example, in his magnus opus, The Constitutional Liberty, sort of emphasizing the manner in which humankind has effectively sort of stumbled, upon the sort of the sort of sense of progress that it has achieved. And it's been able to do that by at least in sort of more freer societies, it's been able to achieve this by sort of affording individuals sufficient agency, sufficient autonomy to be able to pursue the idiosyncratic and unique ends in ways that will hopefully sort of be very beneficial, for others. And indeed, it seems to me that much of the sort of process of innovation, we can talk about innovation in terms of sort of political schemes or normative values, which emancipation is one of those, or we can sort of talk about technological innovation or innovation in materialities, where it seems to me that you really do need institutional environments that are sufficiently open, sufficiently sort of flexible, and probably sufficiently neutral as well, with respect to what will sort of come in advance, which has really been probably at the sort of the cornerstone of this very unique and very curious achievement that we've had in the modern world, which is this hockey stick of growth that sort of someone like Deirdre McCloskey would sort of talk about, other growth theorists and innovation theorists would talk about.
And one of the amazing things about the hockey stick growth, so I mean, that's simply the graph that shows the radical explosion of wealth and GDP in the world in the last couple of hundred years. And one of the things that I think complexity theory and evolutionary theory bring into this is also realizing that the hockey stick is not just about quantity, but it's about quality. That is, more is different, as Philip Anderson would say. That is, we're talking about a process where as you get more, what you also get is more kind of spaces open up, more connections open up. And these spaces, these connections are new niches. And this is one of the things that also Roger Koppel has of course talked about, who we kind of engage with in our joint paper in the European Economic Review, in the paper you mentioned with Nathan Goodman, where we talk about the institutional aspects of the process of combinatorial innovation. But as the possibility of combinations, possible combinations combinations of goods and ideas increases, you get things like the massive explosion in technologies, in goods, and also on the other hand in ideas. The realm of ideas expands, and also what is capable of being sustained as the wealth generates the possibilities of sustainable types of life forms, of cultural forms that would have been deemed, rightly or wrongly, as unsustainable before. And I think that's really part of the emancipation, is thinking about how emancipation from the shackles of poverty itself is, as sort of, I think even a lot of Marxists would accept with this basic premise, even if they disagree about what brings that about. But a lot of them do kind of, like, at least originally Marx himself admired in some of his writings, at least, the productive power of markets to bring about the eradication of poverty, but also the eradication of the hierarchies and power structures of feudalism that preceded it. And I think what we're saying is that the liberal project is by no means complete, and that Marx's kind of like way of forward is not the right. It's a path. It's a dark alley that we don't want to end up and be mugged again, as we have so many times before. But we have brighter path ahead and brighter alleys to follow. But would you agree with what I just said? And how do you see kind of the link between the material and the cultural aspects? I mean, you already talked about there's these four corners, right? But I mean, but do you agree that there's this like idea that it's impossible to think about cultural liberation without material emancipation, and we shouldn't talk about material enrichment without considering the cultural aspect?
Yeah, look, I would agree with you on that. Deirdre McCloskey, who I figure I've just referred to, would sort of make this point. I mean, but to be fair, I'll just sort of recalibrate a little bit about that. She'd probably tend to sort of emphasize the ideational or the sort of non-economic sort of aspects of progress and improvement, as opposed to sort of, let's say, institutions or materialities. But I think actually sort of put them both together. Actually, you can't really sort of have one without the other. You've got to actually have sort of ideational sort of space that sort of gives the presumptive right for an ordinary sort of person to be able to use their sort of agency and resort to reference to their unique circumstances to be able to project the sort of unique aims and aspirations and ventures into the world. You have to allow that at a sort of a normative and valuational sense. But of course, it would seem to me that without a sort of a world of abundant or cornucopia of materialities, many of the sort of potentials that may be sort of grasped by innovation will just simply not be had. So I really liked the sort of point you sort of just made a few moments ago, Otto, when you sort of refer to sort of quality. So this sort of research by Roger Koppel et al. That you sort of referred to as one of our sort of motivators for our joint work, it effectively sort of focuses upon sort of the materialistic sort of aspects of innovation, right? So think about the way in which, for example, let's say a sort of vehicle is a motor vehicle is a derivative of an engine. It's a derivative of the ability to, sort of use and reshape rubber in certain ways, and, sort of all the many other sort of aspects that go into it. And now, obviously, of course, with some modern motor vehicles, there's a lot of computational power embedded, let's say, in virtually in your dashboard. And so that's probably a nice example of this sort of idea of innovation being able to sort of stack and build sort of one sort of set of sort of products or techniques or processes one upon the other to be able to sort of create something anew. But you referred to the qualitative aspects as well. And so, there's actually quality competition that exists out there in the economic world and also in the non-economic world that might in itself be regarded as being susceptible or at least receptive to these sort of these theories of innovative recombination that we're talking about. And I think one of the sort of central contributions of our paper is to sort of just invite Koppel et al. And other scholars who are thinking about this evolutionary, qua innovative sort of process of the adjacent possibles of building one thing upon the other to, create ever more goods and services, to actually just sort of think about, to not ignore the importance of one qualitative aspect, and that is the institutional environment itself. This can be sort of given many descriptors, and it has Acemoglu, for example, refers to inclusive versus extractive institutions. Douglas North et al. Refer to, let's say, limited access orders versus open access orders. The point here is to, in this distinction, is to say that institutions of such qualities that provide sufficient liberty space or freedom space to enable people to tinker with goods, processes, qualities, are likely to actually be environments in which you're going to see sustained improvements. You're going to see the realization of the hockey stick. And again, in saying all that, there seems to be, as McCloskey says, some sort of normative prerequisite for this to occur. And I will sort of say, as a sort of speculative point about the sort of the normative aspects of all of that, sometimes I wonder whether the sort of contemporary fashion for talking down economic progress may in some way, along some margins, be implicated in the sort of the flatlining living standards that we've been experiencing. I could probably make a very sharp point on that to say, well, look, where are our sort of mass produced flying cars by now, right? They're yet to be had, and to the extent that they are yet to be had, may in some part be attributable to a talking down of sort of market processes, economic processes that are actually sort of germane to the progress that we sort of take for granted. I will sort of just make one sort of final point as a sort of a digression, because it's a theme that's been recurring in our conversation, Otto, and that is this Marxist claim that sort of markets are guaranteed to induce oppression. Well, it seems to me to be in part attributable to the quality of the institutional environment, but some perceptive neo-Republican philosophical scholars, for example, I think his name's Ross Taylor, with his book called Exit Left, makes the point actually that markets are actually a very important component of non-domination, to the extent that competition, vibrant evolutionary competition, is allowable. Another sort of thinker, the German jurist Franz Bohm, who was an ordo-liberal scholar, said in the early 1960s that, in fact, market competition is the most important disempowerment device known to humankind. So it seems to me to be able to realize the non-domineering, the non-exploitative potentials of the market probably does require, in some part, quality institutions and a good normative value set that is encompassing of human agency.
And I believe there are issues in which emancipatory liberals and Marxist critics of the existing order can find ways of criticizing the same things. They just have a different diagnosis of what that counts as. Is that an aspect of capitalism? For example, I attended a lecture by Judith Butler a couple of days ago at Columbia, and I have great respect for Butler's work on gender theory and those kind of aspects, kind of having more of a kind of a the productive side of postmodern thought, which I think is still very valuable.
Yeah.
But in her analysis, it recurred this idea of ultimately we have to build all of this into a critique of capitalism from a surprisingly orthodox Marxist point of view, which I find very disappointing, because we have had over a century now of both theoretical and empirical reasons to doubt the Marxist story. And I think Marx himself would not be a Marxist if he were alive today, but if I dare say so.
Yeah.
So I think I think your work is really amazing, and I'll just I think we're getting close to the end of our discussion here, but I do want to, have a couple more things here. So first, you've written about crypto, and we did mention that earlier as well. So, I think this really highlights what you were just saying, that the importance of economic and technological innovation as being like core of it. Like, we shouldn't ignore that and just say, oh, let's just focus on the non-material things, because it's all bound up together. And how do you see that, for example, like crypto technologies, they're not just like financial assets, they're not just get rich quick schemes, right? But they actually can be ways that you can find spaces of freedom for like marginalized people and people who are trying to build up something new for themselves.
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, I wrote a paper for the Chinese Public Administration Review a couple of years ago with respect to the applications of blockchain technologies for charities, for example. And it seems to me that despite some of the sort of public controversies in Western countries surrounding cryptocurrencies, it seems to me that in the global South, for example, cryptocurrencies are becoming, pretty much a mainstay. For example, in terms of facilitating financial inclusion, to be able to provide aid monies in ways that can sort of escape the lure of, let's say, predatory governments and sort of financial institutions and so on and so forth. So these technologies can be potentially very powerful. I would tend to think that notwithstanding how ubiquitous that certain cryptocurrencies such as sort of Bitcoin and Ethereum sort of may well be, I think a lot of the potential, the emancipatory potential of blockchain is yet to be sort of implemented. Certainly there have been sort of visions in early stage blockchain studies that refer to a sort of radically emancipatory separation of money and state. Even Hayek in the late 1970s in his pamphlet for the Institute of Economic Affairs, the denationalization of money, refers to these potentials. So that's something that's waiting to happen. And to the extent that sort of such potentials have incredibly de-inflationary effects, I think this would be incredibly good, actually, for people on lower incomes.
Excellent. And I also want to close off by mentioning that one of the things you've been working together with Nathan Goodman on is the idea of liberation of sexual and gender minorities and LGBT rights. And this is one of the things that is also, I think, coming out. It's it can be found here in this book already, but you also have a new book coming out. And as someone who's like proudly queer and bisexual, I'm really happy that we live in a world where that's possible to say and do. But tell me a little about your forthcoming book, Rainbow Liberty, and that's being co-written with Nathan Goodman and Jordan Lofthouse, right? And when is that coming out, and what should we expect from that?
So we are under contract to produce this book, which will be another sort of edited volume by the end of March. So a couple of weeks' time, we'll be, even before then, perhaps even as early as next week, we'll send all the materials on to the publisher. We have 12 chapters. We have a wonderful array of established and emerging scholars who will talk about everything in relation to sort of the intersection between liberty and liberalism and LGBT lives and experiences, all the way from, let's say, digital commons, how sort of queer people use digital sort of spaces to be able to form collaborative and healthy relations, right through to issues in relation to queer entrepreneurship, even to talk about some of the sort of challenges that our LGBT communities are experiencing. For example, there'll be a chapter about transphobia, looking at that as a perverse and more emergent order. Nathan Goodman has some work about problematizing the so-called protective state of the military and police, and the quite vexing sort of ongoing relationships between the protective state and LGBT. We're extremely excited about this. I think this will be very much a path-breaking work. And in the end, Otto, I think this is kind of what I see my ultimate mission in life is to basically explore in an evolutionary sort of sense. So I'm sure it'll be receptive to you, all those sort of relatively underexplored niches, which I think personally are incredibly important, but for various reasons have been understudied, by sort of our set of mainline political economists or by classical liberal thinkers. So I see myself as very much a niche explorer in the most earnest ways intellectually.
I think what you're doing is engaging in a very important historical course correction of putting together the ideas of freedom and emancipation across all of these domains, economic and social and cultural domain. And I think that's what GMU is doing. That's what I hope to contribute myself. And I think that's clearly what you've done here. So let me just again show the book, and I will also put the link to it. And I will put a link to your Mercatus page to people for them to find out anything more. And is there anything else you want to add to the end, or do you have other things you want to plug? Your future book, it will be called Rainbow Liberty, and so expect that as well. Anything else you want to plug at the end here?
Oh, look, I mean, there's so many sort of things to plug, Otto, but such little time. I just really wanted to thank you for the opportunity to appear on your podcast. I'm not going to sort of shame you, hopefully, in saying that I very much admire your scholarship. I think you're one of the most incredible sort of rising stars in classical liberal philosophy and thinking, and that everyone should pay very close attention to your work. And consistent with that sentiment, it's been a great honor to be able to speak to you on the podcast today. Thank you.
Well, blush. Thank you very much. And always great to talk to you, and all the best to you. And I'll see you soon, and I'll talk to all of you soon, and everybody who's listening. Thanks for listening, and until next time.